Welcome to Sam Explains It All, a multimedia project meant to help you explain the things you love. I'm your host, Sam, and our topic today is Over the Garden Wall and American Gothic venturing into the unknown. Today's special guest is Abbey Zahoroiko, a very close friend of mine and probably going to be our long-term editor for the essays of this series, and also a specialist in anthropology and English. Abbey, do you want to talk about yourself a little bit?
Oh boy, do I. Yeah, so I went to school for anthropology and English, two of arguably the worst things to do in your career, but I love both of them, and I like editing people's stuff. I like reading classical things. No, I don't. That was a lie. And I like digging up dead people.
That's why we had you come on, is because I know you don't have anything to do after 10 o'clock p.m. because neither of us have well-paying jobs because of our fields of study.
Thing that I do post 10 p.m. is usually sleep because I'm an old person.
Yeah, I'm keeping you up. So one of the reasons I want on this topic is because you have like a very particular look at how literature plays into a society. And I believe American Gothic is one of the bigger things that have shaped both modern literature and also kind of America as a whole. But we're narrowing that focus a little bit, and we're going to be looking at the series Over the Garden Wall. And I'm going to give just a little bit of a brief rundown of it. Over the Garden Wall, for those who do not know, is a 10-episode miniseries that aired in 2014, and it saw immense success with its run. It won 2 Emmys in 2015 for Outstanding Animated Program and Outstanding Individual Achievement in Animation. Additionally, the series was nominated for Annie Award and the Teen Choice Award. The series follows brothers Wirt and Greg, as well as the companion Beatrice, a human turned into a bluebird, as they traverse their way through the unknown, a indescribable location that is made up of vast woods and a kind of a smattering of early American colonization and pioneers. The main characters, Wirt, which is voiced by Elijah Wood, and Greg, voiced by Colin Dean, find themselves wandering throughout the woods alone, finding multiple characters such as the Woodsman, a recurring character voiced by Christopher Lloyd. There are a couple major points of focus that I do want to take while we're doing this. The main one is the illusions within it and the formatting of the story. So we're going to talk about the illusions first. The big one that everyone talks about when it comes to Over the Garden Wall is its allusions to Dante's Inferno, which have to do with Beatrice, the bluebird, who is another character from Dante's Inferno who leads Dante through hell as kind of the tour guide of the place. Abbey, have you read Dante's Inferno, or do you know much about it at all?
Can't say that I've read it, but I also just looked up the Wikipedia. So yeah. I basically read it then.
Yeah, so you're the expert now at this point.
Virtually at this point.
A little fun fact that I don't think you knew that might be very interesting for the illusions of this is that in Dante's Inferno, the ring of hell that is reserved for people who succumb to suicide is where they turn into trees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is really cool.
So for those of you who have read the series or who are not aware, this is going to be very spoiler heavy. We are focusing in on things that we believe are already known by our audience. So if you do not know any of this and you don't want anything to be spoiled, just don't listen to this podcast.
Also, Over the Garden Wall is literally like 110 minutes. Like, just take 2 hours out of your life and just go watch it, and then you'll understand this whole entire podcast.
Yeah, just sit down. Just sit down for a little bit like we all do. I mean, after the quarantine, everyone should have watched it at this point.
Basically.
There's no excuse.
Not even like a long movie.
No,
It would be a
it's
really short movie.
it's like enough for a good fit of popcorn, and that's it.
Yeah.
But obviously, for those who have watched it, trying to reawaken some of the things, Wart, Greg, and all of the children who are lost, or anyone who's lost in the unknown, is turned into a type of tree that feeds the lantern. This is a very particular punishment because citizens following Dante's Inferno, each of the locations is supposed to be a temptation for them to stop at, for them to succumb to. And the fact that the beast, who is this unthinkable force that is tempting them, who wants them to stop, to end up in the cold, in the dead. It is them succumbing. It is them giving up hope. It is them effectively committing suicide, because the only reason they stay alive throughout the whole series and that eventually they wake up is that they hold on to hope, that they don't lose
Hmm.
it. And I think, what is it, the woodsman who says it, like the beast is the lost hope or something like that?
He basically says, like, yeah, he kind of says that in beginning. He basically tells the boys, like, this is more, like, lost. You're more lost than you'll ever be. That's what he says.
Yeah, exactly, which again is an illusion. It's foreshadowing to the later events that to lose hope is effectively, especially in this animation sense and in Dante's Inferno sense, is to commit suicide, for them to just
Hmm.
succumb to everything. That's the big one. And while I would love to focus on Dante's Inferno, it is not where I want to particularly focus. I want to narrow it a little bit more and talk about the formatting and how it plays into American Gothic. Abby, just to like a super vague understanding, what would you say American Gothic is?
American Gothic is a type of well, first of all, American Gothic is that portrait that everyone on Earth knows,
Mm-hmm.
of those creepy old people who hold a pitchfork. But American
Yes.
Gothic literature is it delves into the creepy and the uncanny and the uncomfortable. It is not as horrific or as terror-inducing as just regular Gothic literature. It's just a subdivision of that, and that's what makes it, I think, so popular and so driven, especially in uh, colonialist literature, is that it's supposed to be even remotely to feel real in a creepy way. You are supposed to realize, like, hey, maybe this could happen. But then, like, ghosts show up, and you're like, oh, wait, maybe not. But then you're like, huh. You're always on edge. You never know what exactly is going on, and you're always uncomfortable because there's never answers.
The true creepiness about a lot of American Gothic is that it could not be a ghost. It could just
Hmm.
be a guy overthinking something.
Hmm.
And you did hit a couple of things on the head that are very important. There's an essay by Fag Ringel titled Early American Gothic, Puritan, and New Republic. There's just a few key annotates that talk about American Gothic as a genre that I do want to bring up. So, one of the first things you talked about is that it is a subdivision of Gothic, which is very important because Gothic usually involves the old world,
Hmm.
England and such. A quote from the essay: one startling approach to creating Gothic terror in the New World was to import the Old World's castles along with dungeons, cruel aristocratic fathers, loyal familiae, peasants, conspiracies, and the dead hand of the past. Those are major characteristics of Gothic that have been transported to what is now known as American Gothic. But when you think about Gothic, you're thinking about Dracula, Frankenstein, that the Count of Monte Cristo, those particular old world big castles,
Hmm.
bats, and that type of mood. But those are inherently monsters. Like Dracula was a
Yeah.
vampire. Victor Frankenstein had a monster. There was always a physical entity.
Gothic is intended to be real horror.
Yes. It was supposed to give you something to visualize, which, I mean, it's been
Hmm.
taken over and over again. You can look at all of the movies that have been created. That's where American Gothic takes a different turn. And another important factor about American Gothic is that it was known as the poor man's literature. It was competing with modernism at that point. And so people who had money usually read modernist texts. People who don't have money were scaring themselves shitless with American Gothic. So American Gothic is inherently ahistoric. It revises time and place but never existed. That's something we'll be talking back again later about how this has to do with categorizing Over the Garden Wall into American Gothic. But one thing to think about, and that is a recurring thing, is that in a lot of American Gothic literature, they don't specify a location or a time. So if you think about Edgar Allan Poe's works, you're never quite think about Cask of the Amontillado.
Mhm.
I can think very vividly off the top of my head about every single sequence that happens. They go into a catacombs, they go there, but I cannot for the life of me place it in a particular location or time. It just
Mhm.
happens.
I just looked it up. Internet says in an unnamed city in an unnamed specific year.
Mhm.
Like, oh yeah, so it's just it exists, but does it?
Yeah, not only is everything else, not only is the entire story vague enough that you're like, what's happening, but it's never grounded in a location or time either. So you can't decide what it means. Like, you can't be like, oh, there's a monster here because they had monsters in early Gothic, because I mean, they could just be in Philadelphia for all we know.
I like that you said that it's not grounded in something specific, because that's very often what literature is supposed to do. You are supposed to write something even fantastical in a way that your audience is able to identify with something. And when you write American Gothic, where everything is supposed to be unknown, that makes it unsettling for the reader even more, because they can't identify anything. They can't identify themselves with the story. It's just exactly why Over the Garden Wall, I think that's so funny that they call the forest the unknown, because that's literally what American Gothic is. It explores what the unknown is and clearly undefines it.
So there's just a few more quotes that I want to bring up that help ground this particular podcast in a little bit more understanding and research. Another thing I want to talk about is how the frontier played into American Gothic. So another quote: the original frontier narratives presented the journey into the wilderness not as a quest, but as a captivity. The ordeal of the first American heroes, usually female, struggling to keep the light of faith aglow in a heathen darkness. That has to do with the captive narratives that happened during a lot of the indigenous wars that the settlers fought, and how women were taken, and they wrote their narratives and they became these amazing heroes. Think of Mary Rowlandson's stories about how she became this amazing hero who kept her faith alive in Christianity against the oppressive heathens of the world. A lot of that first statement bled into American Gothic, because instead of being these heroic adventurers like Lewis and Clark and everything, they became trapped in the new world. The wilderness was not welcoming. Their quest was captivity.
They became like the unwelcomed heroes. They didn't ask to be a hero.
Mm-hmm. Which again plays into that, and we'll be bringing that up later. And one more quote that's very important is how it's not just the woods that is scary. All of American Gothic is supposed to be scary, because there's this sense of loss, of being lost somewhere. Whether in the alleys of Philadelphia or the caves or forests of the frontier, and this is talking about a particular author, but it bleeds into the full thing. Charles Brockden Brown's characters are astray. They, not their houses and landscapes, are haunted. Their minds are their own dungeon. American Gothic is largely founded on how one character views everything, because you are always viewing the story through one person's lens, which is why Wirt, the romantic and sometimes dramatic main character, is so important, because he really does ground it in American Gothic, which is then why his turnaround later on is so satisfying, because he does not play into that last thread of American Gothic where he succumbs to his overthinking and he listens to the vices. He actually for a moment steps out of his narrative and is like, okay, hold on a second.
Your classic American Gothic, your classic, like, just unknown stuff, always a forest, obviously. Forests are scary as shit. But also the mind. The mind is the one thing where, like, if you get lost, there is no map getting out.
So we're gonna change tides a little bit. We need to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. We brought him up a little bit, and he is going to be one of the key players in how Over the Garden Wall pulls half of its narrative into the story. So all the next couple of quotes are coming from Romanticism and the American Gothic by Alfred Bendix. And I'm going to start off with this quote that I think Abby, you'll very much appreciate it. Orphans who had to find their true place within an established hierarchy, not on individuals struggling to create new identities in a fluid, rapidly growing nation. So what this quote is saying is that as the world continued to change, as children, as people, as any kind of literary figure had to find something new, their identities, their brains, and often themselves became lost in what is known as the unknown because they couldn't place themselves in a hierarchy.
Isn't that a song, like that one song from Treasure Planet?
Yes. Well, it was by...
I am not a moment to be real. Wanna touch things I don't feel. That song?
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure
Goo
that's
Goo
what that's
Dolls.
about.
That was by the Goo Goo Dolls.
Yeah.
Which was crazy finding that out after watching the movie when I was like 14 and be like, wait, hold up. The people who made Iris were hired by Disney. Not part of this podcast, but go watch Treasure Planet. It's really good.
So this is a Treasure Planet podcast.
Yeah, now before it was
American Gothic and Treasure Planet. Delving into the unknown. That's all that Jim does.
Let's talk about the hero's journey for a second.
He didn't ask to become a hero.
And that's inherently the gothicism of it.
Yeah.
But let's talk about...
So what were we talking about before that?
What was his name? Wirt? Worm?
Wirt?
Oh, that guy.
Elijah Wood?
Oh my gosh, I love his work.
Wasn't he The Hobbit?
He was really good in that. He
wasn't in The Hobbit, he was in Lord of the Rings!
He pretended to be. You know what?
He was in the first movie for literally a minute.
Okay, there you go. He was in The Hobbit. You could make a really good argument, though. It's similar to if you go back and watch newer releases of Episode 6 of Star Wars, and they cut out the original guy who played Darth Vader, and they put the really hot Anakin in his place as the flame spirit that shows up at the end of the movie.
So you know how in Lord of the Rings, in the second movie specifically, the two hobbits get taken away, and then they run away after Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli are looking for them, and they follow them into Fanghorn Forest, the scariest forest on Earth that you don't go into because it's so unknown. So anyway, Over the Garden Wall.
No, but actually pulling it back, I want to talk about episode 9, where you learn about Wirt as a
modern life.
As when you learn about Wirt as a person. Let's talk about how he doesn't fit in. Let's talk about his limbo for a little bit. So one of the big things about American Gothic, especially when we're talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, these big names in the industry, how Elijah Wood, the truest writer of American Gothic. Who's the other guy? Oh my god, what's his name? Who's that bitch?
What?
Sleepy Hollow. Who wrote Sleepy Hollow?
Let's look it up. Sleepy Hollow book author. Washington Irving.
Yeah, Washington Irving.
Rip Van Winkle.
That's it. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Washington Irving.
Yeah, Washington Irving's short story Rip Van Winkle has this old guy, not really an old guy, but he doesn't quite have a place in society, and then when he comes back, he goes up in the mountain and he falls asleep, and he falls asleep for 100 years, and then when he comes back, the whole world has changed. This is a characterization of American Gothic that isn't quite foundational to Washington Irving, but is utilized later, where these characters don't have a set place in their society. Wirt, it feels out of place in the whole story. He doesn't feel like he belongs anywhere till the very end of the series when he comes into himself. But he's quoting poetry and he's over talking and he's trying to be the hero and he's not being the hero. And then you learn about him as a person and you see him fumble around with people who genuinely want to spend time with him because he just doesn't get it.
Yeah, he's your classic nerd.
Yeah, he is your classic nerd. And it's funny too because you expect when you first see him, you think people are going to make fun of him. Like all of his fears are going to be confirmed because we all grew up on the same 80s, 90s media where you bully the nerd. And no one does that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well,
except
to us.
Yeah. You know.
Yeah.
We'll bully him.
We'll bully him? Oh my god.
But no one does. They're like, oh yeah, go to that party. And when Greg is like, oh, let's go in, and Wirt's like, we weren't invited. Wirt walks in and everyone's like, Wirt! And he's like, hi.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean but that's foundational into why Wirt works as a main character, because he embodies this concept of American Gothic that there is no set place for him. And that's why he then breaks the conventions of American Gothic, because he manages to find a place in the world.
For anyone confused about maybe what Wirt was like, think of that one scene in Meet the Robinsons.
Oh my god, yeah.
When that kid, whose name I can't remember at the moment, he's like, everyone hated me, but everyone at the school was like, hey, do you want to like come to my house today? We love
Goob.
you. Oh my god, you have such a cool binder.
It was Goob.
It was Goob. Yes, Goob. They're like, hey, Goob, I love you. And he's like, everyone hated me. That's Wirt.
It is exactly like that. So another quote is, a source of terror rooted in a loss of identity and a plunge into nature as the liminal space of transformation. And then nature as a place where one can become lost and an understanding the fragility of identity in the new democratic world. So Romanticism and American Gothic is starkly rooted in this concept that democracy was just starting to flood. This is coming right after the Revolutionary War. It starts off with Washington Irving, kind of ends with Edgar Allan Poe. And one thing that a lot of these authors took into account was how people were feeling about changing ideas. So they went from a very largely governed by England and then became governing themselves, and people kind of felt lost in that world. And so what a lot of these authors did was they transposed that sense of loss of identity into the scariness of the woods of America. Because not only is going to America learning about the new world and experiencing new things, it is losing what you have foundationally thought of as yourself. Like, you used to be English and now you have to become American, which isn't even defined as anything other than scary woods.
And what's so, actually, I love what you said, being lost in nature. The stark similarities of American Gothic with Romanticism and even fantasy is that American Gothic sees being lost in nature as scary, terrifying, creepy, terrible. But in fantasy and Romanticism, if you get lost in nature, suddenly you found yourself. You're a new person. Everything is great because you're in one with nature now. And that's what American Gothic takes, and it twists it. It makes nature wrong.
And going back to how a singular character plays into that, because Wirt is the one who's lost. Greg is never really lost, ever, in the story. He's actually forced to become lost. But how the woods plays into that and how the landscape plays into that is that there are two big things that Poe in particular mastered, is that there's never really specified source of anxiety or injury. So throughout his stories, people are crazy, they're hurt, that something is wrong, but you never quite understand what's going on. And that all of his characters fail to understand the meaning of their own stories. And that constitutes the most American version of that mode, even when his stories seem to evade specific national identity. So, long story short, all of his main characters never understand what their story is about. They always tell it wrong. They always do something wrong that they shouldn't. That they were almost close enough to having a different story, but they fucked up at some point, and then their story became not fun.
The beauty of Over the Garden Wall, where Wirt becomes smart for like a minute at the very end.
Oh, it's so good, and it's
so satisfying.
It's built on years of assumptions. Over the Garden Wall is so self-aware because it knows American Gothic, when it was first being formed, was having to compete with all these other narratives where people were becoming their own heroes, and there was a ton of propaganda going around about the white man in America and like England and everything, that having characters that just were lost and didn't know what to do with themselves was new, and it was exciting, which is why people picked up American Gothic left and right. So then years and years go by, and everyone has read Poe. Everyone knows the anxiety of American Gothic, and to have a story set up in the same way, like tit for tat, that you could read The Raven, and then all of a sudden to subvert all of those expectations is probably the greatest form of American Gothic that you could do. And it inherently changes the outcome of the story so that it is not American Gothic.
Right. I mean, that's that expectation for the main character to fail and to die or to have something really awful happen to them is completely rooted in just Gothic literature, where the hero will always lose in horror.
Yeah, that's what makes it horror because it would change genres.
You're supposed to be scared, but in American Gothic, you're supposed to just be unsettled, and then you just expect the main character to just be dumb and do the dumb thing. Because that is the thing that they always will take away from Gothic, is that you will lose kind of thing. So like, even though in American Gothic you are like a more realistic character, your character has better thoughts, I guess, a bigger brain, maybe. And then all of a sudden they do the thing where it's like, well, why would you do the thing? Why would you do the thing?
That,
you know? And then they die. And then in American Gothic, in Over the Garden Wall, Wirt doesn't do the thing that is dumb.
Poe went on record to say that the greatest horror is the human failure to understand the world in front of us. That's what he wrote about, is how people didn't understand the world in front of us. And Wirt does. He gets the world in front of us, but again, it is not to the detriment of the series. Like, him doing that does not all of a sudden make it not American Gothic. I think it actually makes it more American Gothic.
And it also took him 9 episodes to get it, you know? So, like, it still really followed that format for a really long time, especially when, like, in the very beginning of the series, the very first episode, he's being like, oh, we shouldn't trust the woodsman, when, like, IRL, you'd be like, wait, woodsman, why are you here? Like, you would just ask him a simple question, and he would be like, oh, yeah, the beast, doesn't like me, and I like am doing this oil thing to keep his spirit alive or whatever. And you would find out, like, within seconds, that maybe the woodsman's a good guy, but he just immediately assumes things, and then it just ruins. It literally is the reason that they are stuck for so long, is because he did the dumb thing early on.
Wirt's mental state changes both the seasons and it changes the story. Because when he's at his highest, it's a beautiful, when he's on the boat. When he's on the boat with the frogs and everything, it's a beautiful fall day. There's singing, there's dancing, everyone's having a good time. And the minute that something goes south, it becomes winter. This is talking about American Gothic, particularly Poe. Literary artistry through a complexity of characterizations that included explorations of aberrant psychology and carefully structured plot that often moves the reader into a nightmare world. As a character changes, the world around them changes. And that is another key factor in American Gothic. Take the Telltale Heart, for example. As you start to get more into his head, as you hear the tick-tocks, or not the tick-tocks, but the thumping of the heart, the language changes, the mood changes, and all of a sudden there's a lot of words that have that but-ump feeling to it.
Yeah, and what's that other one? The Mask of the Red Death.
Yes.
Edgar Allan Poe. That one's just your classic Like, you never know what's going on in this whole story until, like, the very end.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. My bad. It's like opening a door. Have you ever been this happens to me at work all the time, but just you're dead sure that if you open that door to the bathroom stall or something, no one's going to be in there. You're just like, I'm good. And then you open it and then you're like, oh, my bad. And you have to close it real fast. That's what reading The Mask of the Red Death feels like.
I really thought you were gonna be like, you're gonna open a door and you know for sure that someone's gonna be behind it, and then they're not, and I was like, damn, that's creepy as fuck.
Oh, he's just someone who's
But
mid-changing.
you were talking about a bathroom
Yeah,
instead.
I was. Okay, but that happened to me a week ago. Was my I have one male coworker, and I was getting changed in the bathroom, and the only thing I had off was my shirt, and he opened the door. He's like, "My bad," and he slammed it. And then he tried to find me to apologize. He's like, I'm really sorry. I really thought." I'm like, "Bro, it's fine. It was only my tits." And then I walked away.
I sure hope that doesn't happen to me at work, because I work alone, so if I open the door on someone,
It's
I'm
terrifying.
quitting.
Yeah. Either someone got back there who's not supposed to, or you're haunted.
Or I'm haunted, yeah.
I mean,
Probably both.
it's not surprising. Speaking of haunting, let's talk about the landscape a little bit. This goes into formatting. So we're gonna start off with. I want to start off with landscape, because what really drove me toward this particular series, Over the Garden Wall, is that it is inherently not. It doesn't have a location, because take for example I don't remember what episode it is, but it's the rich uncle, or the guy that they pretend is his uncle.
Mhm.
I mean, there are mansions like that in America, but it is inherently supposed to be English. I mean, he talks in a vaguely English accent too. And there's the wife who's French. Like, it's supposed to throw you off kilter that there's this kind of vaguely English location, but there's a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch imagery. There's a lot of that weird Pennsylvania Penns Woods energy, especially in the second episode with Pottsfield.
Hmm.
That is all Pennsylvania Dutch. And I think that's what's very fascinating about this series, is that if any of you live in Pennsylvania or have been near it, the state is still just as creepy as episode 2 of Over the Garden Wall. Like, there is just decrepit barns all over the place for no apparent reason. And I think that's what's so fascinating, is that this is a lot of imagery that people grew up on, in seeing what the pioneers did, seeing what the pilgrims did, how early America was. Like, the unknown is supposed to be a look into America's history, but it has enough speckling of what you see in modern day, with the decrepit barns, with the outfits,
just the festivals, like the weird shit that's going on.
Mm-hmm. And you can still, there are still festivals for that. Like, there are like
Mhm.
bratwurst festivals or some weird stuff, and harvest festivals
All of the time.
And so what is supposed to be ahistoric, it still is ahistoric, because all of a sudden all these things that you have seen in real life, and you've seen in old weird picture books that have like grainy edges, have come together. Like, you've seen the bar that Wirt walks in, because we've all walked into a bar, but everyone's dressed in pilgrim getup. It's so strange how they can show you early America and still keep you rooted in modern day America, because Wirt is supposed to be that melding.
Yeah, but you don't really even know that Wirt and Greg are modern.
No.
You literally don't even find that out until virtually the end.
Mm-hmm. And they're just kind of dressed weird, but you don't really think anything of it, and then you learn about it and you're like, oh. And I think that's what the particular power of Over the Garden Wall is, that it takes you through an oversaturation of illusions. You've got Dante's Inferno, you've got references to early animation, you've got all of the American Gothic illusions, but it still feels like a cohesive story. And you can either pick up on those illusions or you cannot, but you still get the same experience.
And I'm just thinking of this right now, kind of tangential to what we're talking about, but it also blends like that the horror of Dante's Inferno with the fantasy of what Beatrice is.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a single Disney movie that doesn't have a talking bird in it.
Oh.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Hold on.
But it's not like that easy go get 'em fantasy. And also, Greg is just like so aloof the whole time. You literally never know, like, if they're normally in such a fantastical world. Because as soon as they meet Beatrice, you know, what's his name? Wirt is just like, birds aren't supposed to talk. And then Greg's just like, what are you talking about? Like, why would you say something so dumb? Beatrice is just a bro.
Yes.
So, like, there's always this, you are never sure, like, who is right and who is wrong.
That's also plays into the formatting, because it tugs you along very quickly but it feels like a long time. It is a 10 episode series. As Abby said earlier, it runs at 110 minutes, and you are dragged along every single second. It is not a hard series to plow through, but you are aware of it the whole time, which is also very important to American Gothic. Poe was the one who really settled on this. He said his emphasis on literary craftsmanship requires works short enough to read in a single sitting and long enough to allow for a significant development of mood and theme. So not only is the root of American Gothic all of these things that we've been saying, but it is also the concept of the short story, which the creators of Over the Garden Wall have transposed into a mini series or a 10 episode series. You watch it in one sitting and you've got the full story.
If you don't watch it in one sitting, you virtually have to rewatch it anyway, because you're like, I don't understand anything. And that's because no one on Earth understands anything about the show until the end anyway.
Yes. And that's one of the best parts about it, is that you're like, oh, I kind of get it now, I guess.
Kind of.
But like, I'm still confused. But that's the beauty of it, because I mean, even me rewatching it, I've watched this series like 10 times, maybe more.
Mm-hmm.
And the most recent time I watched it, I think it's episode 8, after the after the title card, there is the sound of a train. And I had never heard that all the times I had watched it. I had never heard the sound of a train. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they are foreshadowing how you everything you're learning. There's a few other things I want to talk about, but we are really heavy hitting. Like, these are all very important things, and this is the encapsulation of American Gothic. We do have to talk about Hawthorne a little bit. We talked about Poe a lot. Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, famous for the Scarlet Letter.
I actually read that one. Let's do it. Let's talk about this one.
We're not talking about the Scarlet Letter.
Oh, god damn it.
We're just talking about the guy. Because there is something very important that he specified about his works of American Gothic. The most famous, most anthologized, and most representative of the early Gothic tales were not intended to stand alone, but to appear as a part of a broader representation of the possibilities and dangers of the American spirit. Let me break that down a little bit. Nathaniel Hawthorne was famous not originally as a novelist, but as a short story writer, similar to his counterpart, Edgar Allan Poe. Those are some of his creepiest and weirdest stories that have brought into what is known as modern day American Gothic. Something that is thought as American Gothic and sometimes it's a misconception is that American Gothic cannot be funny. It is this creepy, it is weird. And when I first went into this statement, into talking about Over the Garden Wall and American Gothic, I genuinely was afraid that there was going to be this misconception of listeners that a funny cartoon series cannot be American Gothic. And I still, to a degree, have this fear, especially out of some of the scholars in my field. But Nathaniel Hawthorne's focus and this essays, which is still American of Romanticism and American Gothic, has made it very clear that many of these stories are not standalone. They are written with the intention that other people are writing comedic versions of American life. They're writing just informative booklets. That American Gothic is the only way it works is when it is wrapped up in the full American concept of both the hilarious, of both the scary, of the informative, and everything. So, with that in mind, and understanding that because it is a mini series, Over the Garden Wall excels as an American Gothic piece because it has the humor that offsets the horror.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big statement that I am making, but everything that I have stated has led up to what I believe to be the truth of the matter is that American Gothic is not meant to stand alone.
Yeah.
It is an encapsulation of everything that is America. And Over the Garden Wall is inherently American. It is something we have all seen driving or living in America.
It works because there's other pieces of literature or even other pieces of media that it has to bounce off of.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even just breaking it down a little bit more about that's the big thing. Hawthorne has a couple of things that make him an additional valuable resource when it comes to American Gothic and especially Over the Garden Wall. He has some of his favorite narrators is a historian recounting a young man's initiation into a complex world that will destroy his innocence. So the unknowable frog narrator who recounts the story of the unknown and about Wirt, who's losing his innocence or, in a sense, relearning it. You've also got Hawthorne solidifies a clearly American Gothic tradition in which the great danger is becoming lost in the dark wilderness of a new world whose underlying mythology embraces renewal and rebirth, but whose history included repression and failure. They can get out of the unknown. It is their conscious choice whether they will do that or not. The mythology of the
Mhm.
world, it's alive. Like the unknown is alive. There are people living there and experiencing their life, and they relearn, they renew, they rebirth. They can stop. Greg and Wirt are encouraged to stop at any of these numerous locations and live their life out that way. But it is trying to kill them.
Mhm.
And there's one more. This is the last major quote, and then we're just gonna kind of talk a little bit more and wrap it up. This comes from American Gothic, Realism, and Naturalism by Monica Elbert and Wendy Ryden. This is based off of a book. It's known as The Beast in the Jungle by Henry James in 1903, but how they describe the main character, I think, is very important as we wrap up Wirt's character and how he plays such a pivotal role in making this American Gothic. Marcher, the main character, feels the existential abyss of failed romanticism as he vainly and somewhat perversely awaits a robust, tragic fate, only finally to discover that the tragedy is missed opportunity for human connection and his own narcissistic alienation.
That's Wirt.
That's Wirt. That is Wirt to a T. He only evolves as a character when he takes a step back for one stupid minute and realizes what he did to himself. He, as a character, falls into the trap of his own mind. He falls into the Edgar Allan Poe narrator trap. He falls into the Beast in the Jungle. He is so close to being a tragic American Gothic narrator. And he does it.
Yeah, he even follows that whole romanticism thing. When you find out about his life back at home, in the modern world, and you find out that he's like a romantic, and he just wants to find love, and he wants to play by the book, and he wants to be like a secondary character. If his life was just written and he had his life written out for him, he would love to be just like a secondary character, not the main character. And then he finds out, he just actually has a brain. And he's like, wait, why am I going to let the beast take me? Why am I going to let Greg take my place for me as like a tree person? Why are we afraid of the beast?
Why are we afraid of the beast? Why have I let Greg do this? Why have I let my entire life going up to high school be dictated by my mother's marriage to another man, by my love for a girl that I'm too afraid to talk to not actually there one of the big things is that Greg wants him to join marching band. Do you remember that?
No.
Greg is like he gets excited when Wirt goes to the stadium and Greg's like, "Yeah, join the marching band. Me and Dad always want you to do that." And Wirt kind of goes off. He's like, "You and your dad never know what's good for me." And it's such a little thing, but it's human connection that he has actively ignored. And he's good at it too. And that's the continual theme, is that Wirt tries to alienate himself so hard to make out that like everyone, like people are a villain around him and no one gets him and blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, it's his own narcissistic alienation. Like Monica Elbert and Wendy Ryden were talking about a whole different person, but they got Wirt in a little jar.
The alienation that he created in his own mind, and that's what makes you think about what on the earth actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
Did they die? Did they go to hell for a minute and then actually for real escape? Like, what actually happened?
We're going to do a kind of like a big picture roundabout of some of the big ideas that we talked about, because we did talk about a lot of ideas, but the big ones is that Over the Garden Wall is probably the most cohesive and greatest standing version of what I would consider American Gothic. It has all the illusions that would back it up, that bring people in thinking it's American Gothic. It has a main character who follows all the forms, but it also does not fall prey into becoming what used to be American Gothic. It modernizes the idea by subverting the expectations, which is inherently what American Gothic does. And because of its cartoon format, it has created a perfect way to get out the information and also to put the horror of American Gothic in the foundation of living the American life, which is what makes American
for the
Gothic.
First time, it ends in hope. That's the real kicker.
Yeah. And that subversion is what has created such a standing feeling of the series. Most people I've recommended to, or who have watched this, have thought about this series following it. It really sits in your brain because it does something that very few other things have managed to do, where you sit back for a moment and you watch the hero do the thing that you've been yelling at them to do for 10 minutes.
10 episodes, virtually.
Yeah, you're like, do the right thing, and then episode 10, you're like, oh my gosh, he did it.
Yeah, you're almost surprised. You get to the 10th episode and you're like, well, Wirt and Greg are gonna die because they both have smooth brains and can't think. And then you're like, wait, he survived. He did the thing. He became the hero he's wanted to be, that everyone actually thinks he is.
You're like a mom at a soccer. Have you ever been to a soccer game for like some little kids, and you know the mom's kid who sucks?
I've been to my own soccer games.
Okay. So you might know like where the mom's like, it's a foul, call it ref, and they're like yelling the whole time because their kid sucks.
I'm gonna be completely honest, that was my dad. I was playing soccer and he would constantly be like, go, be on the left side, kick with your front foot. And I'd be like, why are you yelling at me?
And the minute that kid, I guess you in this scenario, the minute you did something right, it's like dead silence. It's like, oh,
yeah,
I didn't expect that. And they're kind of like, they're like showing off. They're like, that's my kid, that's mine.
They did the right thing, like I thought that they would.
I didn't think they'd do it, which is why I've been yelling for 10 episodes straight. But you know what? They shut me up. I'm quiet now. That's the true American Gothic, is just a soccer game. A kid's soccer game.
I think, and you can tell me I'm wrong, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that's like the third ring of hell in Dante's Inferno. It's just a kid's soccer game.
You know, I, having read Dante's Inferno, yes. I mean, it's not, but yes. Like, I never played soccer. I was a softball kid, but my sister played soccer, and I remember during her practices and her games, I would wander to the back of the field, and there was just this huge mound that had like needles and broken fishing wire and glass all over the place, and I would climb up it with a bunch of kids who none of us liked each other, and we would just get cut up all over the place while we were watching a bunch of parents yell at their
You were in
kids.
the third circle of hell.
Yeah, that was exactly where I was. It was so fun.
Walking through this, like, circle of hell, you're just going past, like, fields and fields of kids playing soccer, asking when halftime is. And it never comes.
It never.
Even though there's so many fresh oranges waiting for you.
Halftime never comes. And you know what? That's exactly what the crucifixion of Christ was like.
Oh no. There was supposed to be a ref?
That's not a through line, but I swore up and down in the first episode with Kenzie that I would bring Jesus up in every single episode. So here he is. It's the Jesus hour.
I could have done that so much sooner, honestly.
No, I had to do it.
Oh, okay.
Because it's got, I have to do it again and again and again. So I'll put a little fanfare in this little section, and it'll be the Jesus hour of Sam Explains It All.
Cool.
Okay. I think, Abby, give us some parting words. Give us a little goodbye line. What did you get?
What did I get? It turns out that I was here for Over the Garden Wall and instead talked about literally every other medium of media on the earth instead. Like the Robinsons and Lord of the Rings and just mostly Elijah Wood. And that's how literature is, guys.
It is.
That's what literature is.
It is what literature is. So if we were to, the main title of this was Over the Garden Wall in American Gothic, Venturing into the Unknown. Give us like a little punchy one-liner that goes with that title.
Oh God.
I believe in you.
That's a lot of pressure you're putting on me.
I know, but you're the sexiest friend I have. If anyone can do it, it's you.
I think that's the one-liner. Into the unknown. Be your sexiest self.
You're the sexiest friend I have. Thank you all for listening. This has been Sam Explains It All. Please follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Spotify. Like the show, share it with your friends. You can find me at any of these taglines. And I have just set up a Ko-fi. So it should be on my Twitter if you want to support the show in any way. I have to buy a lot of research books to do all of this stuff. So if you want to help me buy some of my books, I'd really appreciate it. Additionally,
anytime you want to meet Sam in person, she will be at your nearest Taco Bell at 3 p.m. sharp drinking a Baja Blast.
I will. I'll usually have someone with me who went in for me because I don't do that. Like my little sibling or my boyfriend. So you can meet them too. I will also be putting Abby's information if you are interested in her work or any of her editing. And
you guys can just follow me on Twitter because I'm hilarious.
Yeah, follow Abby on Twitter because she's hilarious. But again, please support the show if you really like what we're doing. We'd love to have some input. I would love to see what people are looking for, what brought you here. But as always, stay sexy, stay smooth, and thank you all for listening. This has been Sam Explains It All.
And Abby. Do 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 do.